Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar today, honoring Dr. Schweitzer. And thank you for joining us today. Bauman Bakhtiari, Executive Director of the Basketball Institute. I want to welcome many members of our national academies, American Association of Advancement of Sciences, faculty, and people who have worked with Glenn during the past decade. I also want to welcome Mrs. Schweitzer and Diane Schweitzer. We're really privileged to have you in this important webinar. We are supposed to have Ambassador John Lambert to moderate, but unfortunately he had to be attending to a family issue, so I will be doing the moderating today. Our institute has prepared a video that we are going to show before we get to our speakers. We have two distinguished speakers who have known Dr. Schweitzer. One, Bill Colglazier, who has been over 30 years involved with Dr. Schweitzer, and then we have Professor Najmedin Meshkati, also a professor of engineering international relations at University of Southern California, who has been to many of the workshops, gatherings that Dr. Schweitzer organized. So before I get to more detail on their bios, I'd like to ask Delora to start the video presentation for our participants. Well, thank you very much, Leslie and Delara, for producing that video for us. Now, I think with that background that we saw from Dr. Schweitzer, we are ready to go to Bill Colglazier. And Bill has known Dr. Schweitzer for more than 30 years. He's currently the editor-in-chief of Science and Diplomacy Journal and a senior scholar at the Science Diplomacy Center. He served as an advisor to the Secretary of State as a science advisor. He has published numerous articles. He has also served in many positions at Harvard, at Princeton, and probably as the closest colleague of Schweitzer, he's more familiar with the books and publications and work that Dr. Schweitzer has produced and contributed to us. So I would like to welcome Bill, and we go to his presentation now for this webinar.
Thank you very much, Bauman. It is a great honor for me to speak about my friend and longtime colleague, a person who has inspired me over decades, Dr. Glenn Schweitzer. So I'm going to offer some of my personal reflections about Glenn, what I've learned from him and what he's contributed. But then show you a few slides as well, showing some of his work. He was a remarkable person, and he had a remarkable career. As a person, he had a great intellect. He was a doer, a man of action. Yet he was also a person of high integrity, strong values, and he had a clear vision of the interaction between science and diplomacy and in international affairs. For me, he was an inspiring colleague and friend. He could also be very hard-nosed. He was a realist about this world, and he had strong views about the best way to sort of pursue the relation between scientific engagement with other countries. Nevertheless, I consider him to be a great science diplomat. I really learned all about it from him. And he continued working on this up to his last days on the earth at 93 years old. In fact, he was in active dialogue, trying to initiate some new activities that might be constructive and make progress. And I love that quote from him that was shown in the video about how are we going to save the world today. But like he said, he was also a realist. I first met Glenn. I was a professor, and this was after the Chernobyl accident, a couple of years, and Soviet scientists requested help from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences on trying to set up a regulatory agency, a nuclear regulatory agency like the one in the United States that might help to ensure that the Soviet reactors were safer going forward. And a delegation was sent to the Soviet Union. And Glenn was the professional staff member for that delegation. Like all the things that Glenn did, he may have been the lead professional staff member, but more than anybody else, Glenn was the one directing the activities almost entirely. He was the one that knew the place, he knew the issues, and he was a taskmaster as well. Not long after that, I went on a sabbatical to the National Academy of Sciences in 1991 to the Office of International Affairs, where Glenn was. And then we became working together as colleagues. And that continued for the whole time. I ended up staying for 20 years at the academies as the executive officer, but Glenn and I worked together all that time. And I continued to learn from him. As you heard, he took a leave from the academies in 1992 to go to Moscow to establish and head the International Science and Technology Center, which was to actually help support former Soviet weapons scientists to civilian research activities. But then he returned eventually back to the National Academy of Sciences and led a wide range of activities, not only with then Russia, Eastern Europe, other states of the former Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and others. So let me try to turn to some of my slides if I can share a screen properly. Again, there it is. For those of you that haven't seen it, and we can make it available to the Baskerville Institute, his loving wife, Carol wrote a really a very nice memorial to Glenn and his career that's published in the Washington Post. This has some experts from that, but I would highly recommend anyone that has not seen it to. It goes into many of the details that were in the video. First, I just want to talk just a little bit about Glenn's long-term, decade-long work with the scientific community in the Soviet Union and then in Russia. Glenn was also had incredible energy, and he was an author of a number of books, and many of his activities that he carried out at the U.S. National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. He would often write book-length summaries of the activities that were conducted under that. This is one, Science, Engineers, and Track 2 Diplomacy, a half century of U.S.-Russian inter-academy cooperation. So when he went to the National Academies in the 1980s for up until he continued working even after he sort of formally retired, and he still had a part-time position at the Academy. So over many decades, he's been involved with the Academies between the United States and Russia. Just an example of the many activities he's conducted. Here was a series that was done on with the Russian scientific community on the roots and trajectories of violent extremism and terrorism. The cooperative program of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and the Russian Academy of Sciences from 1995 to 2020. For any of these books that I show here, one of the things I think that may have been my best contribution to the time I worked with the National Academies, all these books now are available for free, or at least links to the on the web, and you can have online copies of these books, PDFs. And I would highly recommend you look at some of them. In fact, if you go to the National Academies Press and just put in a search on Schweitzer, you will be just amazed at how many different books and workshops and other reports Glenn was responsible for. And not only was he the chief doer of many of these activities, he was also an exquisite fundraiser. He was able to talk people, foundations, out of funding to help support the activities that he carried out. Here's another one. This is actually a book that he wrote, Swords into Market Shares. And some of the activities with the former Soviet Union and Russia were all about trying to restore a market economy in Russia and improve the economic situation there. In 1991, again, this was Glenn was the one who spearheaded the initiative to do a report on the need for having more science and technology capable people in the U.S. Department of State. Actually, this report was not requested by the U.S. government. As with many things, Glenn had to go out and try to find support, and he found a donor who was willing to support the conduct of this study. The report was published in 1999. It made many recommendations what the State Department should do, not only about having new people working inside the department with the diplomats who had backgrounds in science and technology, but also the many needs that were almost every issue that our Foreign Office deals with has some aspect that's even growing now, as we all knew, with many emerging technologies and the issues that they create. So in this imperatives for the Department of State, not all the recommendations were adopted, but one that was eventually was the creation of the position of Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State. So that was a great example of Glenn's handiwork and having a real impact. Let me mention the activities with Iran, beginning in 1999 and continuing for 2 decades with the encouragement of both governments over this time. The U.S. Academy of Sciences and the Iranian Academy of Sciences had a very active dialogue, including conducting workshops over this period, sometimes held in Iran, sometimes held in the United States, and sometimes held in third countries. And Again, it did not deal with the nuclear activities, but it dealt with public health, with environmental issues, earthquake protection, all kinds of topics. And they're very well documented in these two books. The first one, U.S.-Iran Engagement in Science, Engineering, and Health, 2000 to 2009. And a more later one, U.S.-Iran Engagement in Science, Engineering, and Health, from 2010. Glenn went to Iran several times. I was able to accompany on two of his trips, which was we received a very warm reception, a very active engagement, talking about scientific topics in Tehran, Shiraz, and other places in Iran. And one of these activities was a very interesting workshop that had the title of Science as a Gateway to Understanding. I think this fits in very well with the Baskerville Institute's approach. This was an international workshop that was held in Iran, with the publication from it. On one of these trips, there's a picture of Glenn. Our Iranian colleagues are very interested to have U.S. Nobel Prize winners go with them. And Joe Taylor, U.S. Nobel Prize laureate from Princeton University, physicist, accompanied us on the trip to Iran, and he gave a lecture at Sharif University. And in that lecture, the students, there were so many students trying to get into that room. They were sitting on the floor, in the back, almost trying to climb the walls to be able to get into the room when Joe Taylor gave his talk. In fact, afterwards, our Iranian colleagues actually created a statue of Joe Taylor. This is a picture of it in Tehran. So it was a great visit we had at Sharif, but also in Shiraz and throughout Iran. He also, just an example of some of the work that he was involved in on environmental issues. This collaboration on Lake Urmia was one of them. So it was also making a real contribution to issues that both countries faced. Also, interesting project dealing with wildlife in Iran, with urban issues and urban development, with energy technology, particular solar energy. On the trip, I think in 2007, the little bit in the back is my wife talking to young Iranian women. She had the pleasure of speaking at a girls' school in Iran with Anita Jones, the wife of the president of the Academy of Engineering, Bill Wolf, at the time. And they had a very engaging dialogue with the young Iranian women. And she actually afterwards sponsored several, equivalent back then of Zoom call. It wasn't Zoom technology then, between students in the United States and students in Iran. This is plus it wasn't all work when we were in Iran. This is when we went to Persepolis, and I'm the one in the red hat. Bill was in the middle. Anita Jones is next to him. My wife is next to me. But we had the Foreign Service, the Mike Clegg, earthquake expert, with us as well in our delegation at that time. In addition to having some of our meetings in Iran, some in the United States, also sometimes it was actually better if we held them in a third party. So there were a couple times we held meetings that were in France, addressing some of these challenges. One interesting one there was on teaching students about ethical and value issues, where we have an active dialogue with our Iranian colleagues. I mentioned that 1999 study that really sparked plug in creating the position of the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State, and also helping the State Department to increase its capacity of people coming in to work at the department, something that's been greatly facilitated by the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, Science and Technology for Policy program, the fellowships, And right now in the State Department, there are roughly each year 30 or more AAAS fellows working in the State Department, and then later the creation of the Jefferson Science Fellow with my friend and colleague, Professor Meshkati, held working inside the State Department as well. I think they're now, let me get this wrong, but now close to 100 former AAAS fellows who are actively full-time employees in the State Department. So it's made a great contribution to increasing the human capability inside the department. The last picture I was going to show before I give some wrap up, this is a picture of Glenn and Carol when they were in Tehran. What I wanted to end with was talk about Glenn and science diplomacy. As I said, he could be very hard-nosed, very practical, a realist, a doer of action, getting things done. One of the things that he continually emphasized to me is these types of science engagements only made sense if they really were at the highest excellence in science. The engagement had to be of mutual benefit. That was absolutely essential in his view. Well, of course, he hoped that these activities could actually hope to make the world a more peaceful place, could actually have other governments rely more on their scientific community for advice and input, perhaps to have a more rational world. But he was enough to realize that politics, at least in the short run, can be a more powerful force than the best scientific engagement. So we thought, at a minimum, we always should ensure that we are doing the absolute best science and of mutual benefit. He made a lasting contribution for scientific capabilities in the U.S. State Department. He influenced and affected, I think, not only a number of American participants who were involved in activities like me, in fact, inspired us, but he also infected many scientists in other countries, even when their government, our government, didn't get along at all. Certainly in Russia and the former states of the Soviet Union, certainly in Iran. And I think there is a lasting legacy that comes from those personal relations that he helped to create. So even though now we're in a very difficult period with conflict, competition, and wars that have disrupted many of the hopes that we might have for the progress that might occur, I think we have to take the long view again, that the extent to which we can maintain international engagement with the scientific communities in other countries. Scientists always find it easy to talk to with others, no matter what background they come from or what country they come from. So that over the long run can be a very powerful force in itself. So for those of us who were inspired by Glenn, learned from Glenn, we think he has a legacy that really has greatly benefited not only ourselves, but the world. And he sort of inspired us to try to follow in his footsteps. Jared Glenn, Carol has been his partner for 32 years, his wonderful daughters and grandchildren. We all miss Glenn very much. As I said, up to his last days, we were in communication, continuing to think about ways that we might help restart dialogues in some of the places right now that are extremely difficult. So I will end there and appreciate this opportunity to honor my good friend, Glenn Schweitzer.
Thank you so much, Bill, for that personal, scholarly, and also the analytic presentations that you provided us to grasp Glenn's contribution better. And most important was your last statement that he looked at all of these activities long-term. And he was a realist. He was not of a person that underestimated the politics of the region. He, as far as I know, he actually wanted science diplomacy between countries that are in adverse relations with each other. And so thank you so much for that. And I hope many of our audience members will notice those good books that you mentioned, and those especially who are free to download. And I'm sure that they will do it. But our next speaker is Professor Najmedin Meshkati. He's a tenured professor at School of Engineering at University of Southern California. He's also recipient of the Jefferson Science Fellow that Bill mentioned. He was a senior science and engineering advisor in the Office of the Science and Technology, advising to the Secretary of State in Washington, D.C. He's a member of the Global Advisory Council of the Civilian Research and Development Foundation, Global, chaired by Ambassador Thomas Pickering. Professor Meshkati has been involved in many of the Track 2 discussions that also involved Iran and Glenn. But also, Professor Meshkati is a visionary who has come up with the idea of engineering diplomacy. So here, that's what we would like him to present to us, both not only his picture of the engineering diplomacy and being a professor in the School of Engineering and International Relations, which kind of provided that perfect foundation to tell us a little bit about how he viewed Glenn Schweitzer and his work.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bakhtiari, and good afternoon, good evening to all our friends and colleagues that are listening. It's really an honor for me to be here. And if you allow me to start by sharing my PowerPoints, because I think this is the reason that I'm here. And do you see my PowerPoints? The first slide, the title slide?
Yes, we do.
Dr. Glenn Schweitzer, a mentor and an indelible legend of science diplomacy. It's very difficult and hard to go after and to follow Dr. Bill Colglazier. Bill has been an amazing mentor also in my life, a friend and a colleague and guest speaker in my classes. But I really would like to say that it's really an honor to see my own name on the same page with the name of late Howard Baskerville at Baskerville Institute, with Glenn Schweitzer name and Dr. Bill Colglazier name, and Ambassador John Limbret, that he's not here, but he knows himself that he is one of my heroes. And we exchange a lot of emails and talk about Saadi and Golestan Saadi. What I would like to tell you, I mean, is, as Dr. Colglazier covered very much what I would like to say, but I would like to tell you a little bit stories from my own vantage point. As a graduate student coming to United States, being exposed to the work of Glenn Schweitzer and becoming his disciple or mentee. That's what I would like to first introduce you a book that really changed my life, and this is this book, Techno Diplomacy. Please note that this book was published in 1989. It was before the collapse of Soviet Union, and it is written by no other person than Dr. Glenn Schweitzer. In this book, in the preface, he defines the term techno diplomacy, which was beautiful to me. Again, remember, I just was back then a young person, a young freshly minted PhD, assistant professor at USC. And this is the way that Dr. Schweitzer defined techno diplomacy. For our students who are listening to this webinar or will later get this book, I would like you to look at his 3 definitions of techno diplomacy: the art and practice of conducting negotiations between countries with conflicting technological interests. The second definition is skill in handling scientific affairs without arousing hostility. And his third definition is ability to resolve issues in the frontiers of science and technology in direction of peace, not war. I think that captures the essence of what Glenn did and what made him an admirer of him. And the rest is really my own story. how and why I admire Glenn Schweitzer. I would like to tell you a little bit about that. But knowing why I admire Glenn Schweitzer, you need to know a little bit about myself. Where do I come from? And the Jefferson Science Fellowship experiment and experience that I had that changed my life. And I owe it very much to the people like Glenn Schweitzer, Bill Colglazier, and Ambassador Thomas Pickering. My work in engineering diplomacy that Dr. Bakhtiari mentioned about that. And I would like to talk a little bit about Dr. Glenn Schweitzer, science diplomacy with Iran that Bill mentioned about that, and some memories and some final types. This is basically the overview. And everything revolves around Glenn Schweitzer in this overview. And I would like to tell you, and I hope that I convince you by the end of my talk, that why I, as a professor, as a practitioner, admire Glenn Schweitzer and what a tremendous effect Glenn Schweitzer had on my life and maybe millions of people like me. A little bit about my background. I think it would help you to know why I'm fascinated by the work of Glenn Schweitzer. I got my BS in Sharif University of Technology and Industrial Engineering in 1976. At the same time, in the evening, simultaneously, I attended political science and economics BA at Shahid Beheshti, National University of Iran. I used to carry 40 units per semester, and I got MS in engineering management and PhD in industrial engineering at USC. As you see from the get-go, I was an interdisciplinary person. I couldn't stick with engineering. I couldn't stick with international relations and political science. And up to this moment, at the age of almost 70 years old, I consider myself an interdisciplinary and a student of people like Bill Colglazier and Glenn Schweitzer and others whom I'm gonna name them. That's why you see this confusion still exists. This is an article from USC Viterbi magazine with a cute cartoon. On the left side, you see that I'm an engineer teaching about nuclear safety and engineering. On the right side is the diplomacy part of it. And I would like you to look at the subtitle of that over there, an accidental professor. I really didn't want to be a professor when I went to school, and I still consider myself as an accidental professor. But this interest in engineering and international relations has been in my life, and that is why you see one of my fascination with the work of Glenn Schweitzer. I'm just going to go through very fast, tell you a little bit of the work that I did here. I've written a lot of op-eds, commentaries with my friends, Dr. Gilbert Fenderesky. The first piece that I wrote on Iran-US relation was in 1992 in New York Times. I had pieces in Los Angeles Times, New York Times, op-eds, letters to editors, and then International Herald Tribune, Los Angeles Times, and some other publications like that Newsday. Throughout the years, everything revolves around US-Iran engagement on science, technology, nuclear safety, aviation safety. This was a piece that I wrote with whom I am very proud of, that with Dr. Akbar Etemad, the former founder of Atomic Energy Organization of Iran under Shah, Deputy Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, pieces about aviation safety, and again, the need for science diplomacy with Iran on aviation safety. And then again, another piece with Dr. Mirfenderesky in Los Angeles Times about arguing against sanction and more engagement. And then I had a series of pieces, again, all inspired by Glenn and our colleagues in Huffington Post, particularly after the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015 in Huffington Post, series of articles in that, and then another one again about JCPOA. This Jefferson Science Fellowship that Bill Colglazier mentioned, that really was one of the highlights of my life. I went to State Department for 1 year in the Office of Science and Technology Advisor. This picture is from an article from USC that they published that, and I was there with some of my fellow Jefferson Science colleagues at our farewell event. While I was Jefferson Science fellow at State Department, I had great colleagues and mentors. One of them you see here, Dr. Andrew Reynolds. Andy has been a mentor and a friend for the last 14 years since I left the State Department. He may be on this webinar, but I want to tell you that I learned a lot from Andrew Reynolds, from Ray Arnado, and many other colleagues at the State Department, whom I got there thanks to the pioneering work of Glenn Schweitzer. And Glenn stayed with Andy, with Ray, with Bill Colglazier throughout in the last 14 years as my mentors and colleagues and friends. I would like to talk with you a little bit about the concept of engineering diplomacy, my research, articles, and the course that I developed at USC with the help of an advisement of Glenn Schweitzer, Bill Colglazier, Andy Reynolds, and Ray Arnado, who was at that time at the Office of Policy of State Department, and they stayed as a friend and mentors. And the research in the engineering diplomacy, I have done a lot of work while I was at State Department. I wrote a white paper that later on I published that in a journal that at that time, Dr. Von Trukian was the editor of that. It's called Science and Diplomacy. Now, Dr. Colglazier, the editor-in-chief. The title of my article was Engineering Diplomacy, an Underutilized Tool in Foreign Policy. With the help of all these great people, I converted this article and this concept to a course at USC that I will talk about that later. But I had another article in Science and Diplomacy on the 10th anniversary of the publication of the first article. It's called Engineering Diplomacy is Necessary to Tackle Global Challenges. In this sequel, I talk about climate change, Boeing 737, Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, and other things. But I converted that work and the advisement and mentorship that I got to a course at USC. This is an article at USC Viterbi magazine in 2017 for the course that I developed. And this is the part of the course syllabus of the engineering diplomacy, subtitle Fusing Engineering with Foreign Policy and International Development. As you see in the highlighted area over here, Bill Colglazier book, some parts of it is part of the course reading for my class. This is the beginning of the course syllabus for the course that I taught last fall at USC. In the area of Track 2 diplomacy, the role of engineering in society, you see Glenn Schweitzer, 1989, is part of my book. Of my course. And of course, Dr. Colglazier was a guest speaker in this class, and some of his articles in Science and also in Science and Diplomacy have been my reading material. Now I would like to talk about Dr. Glenn Schweitzer and his science diplomacy with Iran, and particularly some of my personal interactions with him. Dr. Schweitzer has been an amazing person. This is something that put together for him by the Atomic Heritage Foundation, and I suggest you please to take a look at that. Particularly in this timeline, I would like you to look at this one in 2010 that talks about his book on US-Iran engagement that Dr. Colglazier mentioned about that. I'm going to come back to it also in a second. This was also mentioned in this Atomic Heritage Foundation. The award that Glenn got from AAAS, the citation is beautiful. That captures Glenn at his best. A tireless advocate for international science cooperation and the role of science in foreign relations. That's another reason that I've been always fascinated by Glenn. I admired Glenn, and I try to emulate Glenn at a very small scale that I have from my vantage point at USC. I invited Dr. Glenn Schweitzer and Professor Hassan Vafai, who was Vice President of Sharif University of Technology, to USC in 2015. And I will tell more about Dr. Vafai. I hope that he's on this webinar and he could hear me, because I consider Dr. Vafai is really the partner of Glenn in the work that he did with Iran. At that time, when they came to USC, in the afternoon, we had a meeting with one of my mentor, again, the late Professor George Chilingarian, or Chillinger, that who has been also a legend in his own rights in science diplomacy with Soviet Union, Armenia, and Iran. Dr. George Chillinger unfortunately passed away last year at the age of 93 or 4, and he has been a great friend and mentor. And Glenn and George, it was the first time that they were meeting each other in George's house. And as you noticed, they clicked very nicely. And of course, Dr. Vafai knew Dr. Chilingarian for a long time, but it was for the first time that Glenn met Dr. Chillinger. Glenn had this book, Techno Diplomacy, that I got to know that, and it changed my life in '89. I came across the book in 1992, 93. But what most proud of is Glenn's beautiful, gracious inscription for me. And I treasure this inscription. And whenever I get depressed, I looked at this inscription and it boosts my ego. Glenn wrote for me, Naj, you are a pioneer in engineering diplomacy. You have had an amazing impact in Washington from your observation post in Southern California. With greatest respect, for a close friend, Glenn, April 2nd, 2015. Glenn has been very gracious, but I think he greatly exaggerated here. And I think I attribute that to his graciousness. The only thing that I did, I was his disciple and I tried to spread his gospel. But I still treasure this inscription that Glenn wrote for me. And with respect to Iran, as you saw, Bill showed that it is written in his Washington Post obituary that Carol put together. He started in 1999 this work with Iran. Over 2 decades, he basically brought 3,000 scientists from these 2 countries together. 3,000 scientists. I was involved in 2 or 3 of such workshops that I will be talking about. One of them that I was a co-organizer with Glenn about that. But this is indeed remarkable. Dr. Colglazier mentioned about this fantastic work that Glenn did. This was for the period of 2000 to 2009. I was a reviewer of this book for National Academy. Glenn again wrote a beautiful inscription for me on this book. He said, to Naj, our struggle just begun. In the end, we will succeed. And always this statement of Glenn resonates with me. This was one of the books that he did. The other one, again, that I was the reviewer. Unfortunately, I don't have the signed version of it, but the subtitle of the published version is very interesting because it came during the Trump administration, after Mr. Trump withdrew from JCPOA, as you see that some of Glenn's frustration appears over there in the subtitle, a resilient program, but uncertain future. And it was really after 2018 that Glenn and the rest of us haven't been able to do that much work in this area. One person that I think was a pillar and Glenn's tag team member is Dr. Professor Hassan Wafai of Sharif University of Technology. As I wrote in my review of the Glenn's second book, Dr. Wafai is so humble that he didn't want to be named by Glenn in that book. But I think he was really the Glenn's partner and tag team member in Iran. He was the host of these delegations that they were going to Iran, which was led by Glenn, hosting the Nobel Prize winner, hosting the distinguished people like the late Bill Wolfe and his wife, Professor Anita Jones, Dr. Colglazier, and others. I think this is the time that I acknowledge Professor Hassan Wafai's invaluable contribution to science diplomacy. I hope one day in Iran, there will be a statue of Dr. Wafai at Sharif University as the founding father of science diplomacy in Iran, the same way that Glenn is the founding father of science diplomacy in the United States. Glenn had also some work with Russia. This is the book that Dr. Colglazier showed that. Again, beautiful inscription by Glenn to Najm, a good friend who likes challenging assignment. I love to read that. Yes, challenging assignment, just like giving a tribute to a giant and a titan like Glenn Schweitzer. And this is interesting. In 2017, when Glenn and others, Bill Wolfe, Bill Colglazier, Bill Wolfe started this re-engagement with Iran, there was this beautiful press release that came from national academies. And then another giant in science diplomacy, Dr. Norm Neureiter, who was the science advisor to Secretary of State, and that they wrote this fantastic editorial in Science magazine on 2008. But this is really tragedy that in almost a year after that, in 2009, Glenn was questioned and interrogated for 9 hours, 2 sessions, 3 hours and 6 hours in Tehran in one of his visits. But this beautiful, gracious man didn't give up on Iran. If it was anybody else, like some of us Iranians, we would use an expression that I have to say it in Farsi. He would say, "Sar be taneshun nabashe," meaning I don't want to have these guys to have the head on their shoulder. But he took it with grace, with forgiveness. He forgave. 2009, he was interrogated according to this Science magazine in his hotel room, twice being visited by security officials. But he handled that so graciously. He didn't give up. He continued. This is the man that I admire. I couldn't have done that. This is the man that we all admire. He helped Dr. Norm Neureiter, and I was a co-organizer. We organized a symposium on air pollution at megacities at Beckman Center of National Academy. The first part of it, then they came to USC. As you see, the insignia logos of USC, AAAS because of Norm Neureiter, and National Academy because of Glenn Schweitzer over here. And then the participants came to USC. This is our Dean Yors's nice conference room here on USC campus. Everybody, all the participants, American participants, Iranian participants were here with some of my USC colleagues and students. That the result of that symposium was published in this book that I have it here. And again, I'm very proud to say that the insignia of my USC employer, my alma mater, Sharif University of Technology, National Academy of Sciences, and AAAS is here. And again, we did this work thanks to no other person than Glenn Schweitzer and Hassan Wafai and Professor Surushian at UCI, that he was also a co-host of that. The last time that I saw this giant, Glenn Schweitzer, was with Dr. Bill Colglazier, Dr. Norm Rewriter at the residence of Japanese ambassador in Washington, D.C., which we all were invited to honor another colleague, Kevin Crowley, that received the Rising Sun Medal because of the work that he did on Fukushima Study Committee of National Academy, that I had the honor of remembering that. I was showing these photos to my engineering diplomacy class in a tribute that I had for Glenn. I said, I can say in this photo that I literally and figuratively rubbed shoulder with one of the giants in science diplomacy. And then after this, of course, I had a small tribute for Glenn in my engineering diplomacy class 4 days after his passing in my classroom here at USC. And this picture is taken by one of my students. There are 3 American legends, in my humble opinion. One of them was Howard Baskerville, who, as you know, died at the age of 24 while helping Iranian constitutional revolutionaries in Tabriz. And this is a book, by the way, which is being edited and produced by my good friend, Professor Hushang Esfandiar Shahabi. The second one was Dr. Samuel Jordan, who founded the American College in Iran, which later on became Al-Bors High School, which I attended that, and I got my high school diploma from them. He was an American missionary. And the third one, in my humble judgment, is Dr. Glenn Schweitzer. These 3 American legends are highly respected in Iran. There was, and there is, Baskerville Institute in Salt Lake City. Dr. Bahman Bakhtiari is the executive director. There is Samuel Jordan Center for Persian Studies and Culture at University of California of Irvine. That's my high school alumni and cohort, Dr. Fariborz Masih, is the founder of that at UCI. And I hope one day there will be the Glenn Schweitzer Center for Science and Engineering Diplomacy somewhere in United States, somewhere in United States. I think Glenn deserves, as he is in the same league as the other 2 legends, and he deserves a center for science and engineering diplomacy to be named after him, and he be the namesake of that center. That's my dream, that's my hope. And to the 3 American legends for Iranians, for Baskerville, the Iranian celebrated poet Aref Ghazvini composed that poem that he recited at the anniversary of his death in Tabriz, and this is the original Farsi version of it. And I think that last verse applies to all these 3 legends. And I read the Persian version of that, and I think you can read the English version much better than me without my accent. پاینده باد نام تو روحت همیشه شاد. پاینده باد نام تو Glenn, روحت همیشه شاد. And this was Glenn's inscription for me, and I believe that our struggle has just begun. In time, we will succeed. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Meshkati, and such a wonderful encapsulation of every aspect of Glenn's work that you brought in, added to Bill's wonderful presentation, scholarly, but you brought that human dimension that we frequently miss in our international affairs today. And we're getting some text messages of questions and everything, and I think with this webinar, we wanted to acknowledge that legacy that both you and Bill brought to the fore. And we have students in this webinar right now listening to this. And I think we put it in a context that now as you put it, and also Bill, we put it in context of the heroes of Iranians today. And the heroes of Iranians today, Howard Baskerville, Samuel Jordan, and Glenn Schweitzer. And these are three people who have had significant impact on Iran and with U.S.-Iran relations. So with that summary, I'd like to open the discussion to our audience. We have many, many people you mentioned, Najmedin, who are in this webinar right now. So they heard you, and they heard their names being repeated. And I think they're very happy to see that you took time to come to this webinar. So please let me start with the first question that has been sent to me. The question that has been texted to me actually focuses on some of the issues that you did mention, that Glenn had some trouble in Iran, and he, after those interrogations and so forth, he still kept that with his mission, and kind of he handled it gracefully without making the political issue out of it. The question asks, is it possible to have other Glenn Schweitzer right now with Iran? So we can go to Bill first and then Naj. So is it possible to have other Glenn Schweitzers with Iran?
Well, actually, as I mentioned, Glenn was trying to initiate contacts that actually could turn into some sort of a relationship and maybe a resumption of dialogue between the scientific community. So yeah, he was not the only one thinking about how that might be done. It may not be easy to do right now, but there will be a time in future years. So I think, although Glenn's not here to ably assist, but I think he inspired enough others to know that there will be a time when scientific engagement can be started again with Iran. And
go ahead, Naj.
That's a very tough question. I wish that somebody didn't come up with that question. Being honest with you, I really don't know, because Glenn was very selfless. He was very courageous. He was very energetic. And he would, Bill said that he was hard-nosed. I will add, he was really no nonsense. I mean, for developing that engineering diplomacy course, he advised me a lot, and he was really no nonsense. I really don't know if we can find a person with Glenn's superb technical background, with a master's from Caltech, and then his superb diplomatic background. As Bill said, his fundraising capabilities, his diplomatic skills. I think this is very much like that philosopher king type of thing that we want. I don't know if we can find all these features, all these characteristics in one person. I would say Bill Colglazier is another Glenn Schweitzer, but I don't know if Bill has the same tolerance for us Iranians or not. But he is technically, diplomatically, and administratively, Bill has all that characteristics.
That's great. Another question has come in about Glenn Schweitzer's impact on institutions in the United States. The person is asking the question, as much as we're focusing on science diplomacy with Iran, what has been Glenn's impact on institutions in the United States when it comes to the subject of Iran? Bill?
You know, actually, I think he's achieved a great deal. I mean, many of us, are frustrated by the way things have turned out in recent years. But he certainly introduced a number of American scientists to Iran. They met colleagues, that established friendships, common interest in work and collaboration together, having 4 or 5 workshops a year that dealt with various issues over almost 2 decades. So there's a large cohort of American scientists who have become very interested, that they already admire Iranian scientific capabilities. In fact, a number of over the years, very able students from Iran have come to the United States for going to graduate school and working here. And then also great admiration and respect for Iranian history and culture. So plus, and I mentioned earlier, his contributions to building up capabilities in the State Department to have more people that have scientific and engineering, technological backgrounds, which is even more important today than ever. So I think Glenn had a very big impact on the United States, on the way a lot of scientists think about Iran. And again, as I said earlier, I think there will be a legacy from all that.
If I can just echo Bill, I think one of Glenn's greatest contribution, which again, he worked with Ambassador Thomas Pickering, who is also considered to be one of the founders and promoters and supporters of science diplomacy, is that thing that Bill mentioned, creation of the Office of the Science and Technology Advisor to Secretary of State, and creation of the Jefferson Science Fellowship, which every year, some of us professors from different universities, we go to USAID and the State Department, stay there for 1 year. And I think Glenn's legacy will be perpetuated by these new cohorts of Jefferson Science Fellows, that they go, some of them, like myself, come back and we develop a course at our campus. One of my colleagues in our cohort was Professor John Savage from Brown University. John was a Jefferson Science Fellow over there. He was a professor of computer science at Brown. When he went back, he started developed a course called Cybersecurity and International Relations. You see that Glenn's legacy permeates through these universities by the courses that we teach and we develop at our own universities.
That's great to know. And another question, I think this is from an Iranian colleague, is asking that the situation of science inside Iran is not very good, and scientists do not have the space needed today to engage in international exchanges. What can be done to help Iranian scientists today with science diplomacy?
Yeah, no, that's a very challenging question, obviously. And again, that was exactly the sort of thing that Glenn was thinking about. Trying to see ways that some sort of dialogue could be initiated that could lead to future actual scientific engagement, even if it would be at a very small level. He was actually trying to do the same thing regarding some of the scientists in Russia that he knows. And of course, in the middle of a war, that's almost impossible. He was also a great friend of Ukrainian scientists. And so he certainly understood the complexities of trying to do things in the kind of geopolitical environment that we live in. But nevertheless, he always felt that there was a space by which active scientific discussions could occur, even among countries almost at complete loggerheads. And of course, I'm not a very good predictor of the future. Scientists aren't that great at that either. And it may be a number of years before we can actually try to embark on something that could lead to more active engagement. between the United States and Iran. I'm going to continue trying to think of ways that at least something small that might enable a dialogue. Sometimes it can occur in third-party sites or in multilateral dialogues, although the same thing occurs right now almost with the U.S. and Chinese scientists. But I definitely do not want us to give up on trying to think of other ways that we can engage, even when things have gotten really tough.
Right.
I can just add to what Bill said. Of course, unfortunately, in Iran, everything will be looked from the lens of security. But there are several areas that are less security sensitive than others. That's what I came up with this concept of engineering diplomacy. For example, one area that doesn't require technology transfer in terms of the hardware or software is know-how, is aviation safety. Because, for example, when you look at the crashes of two Boeing 737 that killed 346 people in two crashes, there are many lessons from that crashes that we can take it to aviation industry in Iran. That's what I try to teach that in my engineering diplomacy class, that even in the height of the security situation, even with North Korea, we can talk about the Yongbyon nuclear safety, the nuclear safety of the Yongbyon nuclear plant. I had a piece with a colleague from Harvard managing the atom in the Hill about nuclear safety could be a track to diplomacy with even North Korea. And the other area that I think we still can do that, even in this environment, which is the very big field of patient safety. People that they are dying in the hospital because of preventable medical error. The famous Iranian director, Mr. Abbas Kiarostami, died because of a preventable medical error. I mean, these are the areas that we still can collaborate and cooperate. That doesn't have anything to do with one piece of hardware. You don't need to transfer from this country to another country for doing that. There are still avenues open, but we need Bill Colglazier and Glenn Schweitzer to spearhead these efforts.
That's great. Another question has come in. What was Glenn Schweitzer's view on sanctions? He seemed to be against sanctions on Iran, but can you elaborate on his views on sanctions? Bill?
That's interesting. I'm not sure I completely know. Glenn often was very wise in deciding not to speak out on some things that might make it very difficult for engagement. I know in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine that, but like I said, he could also be more of a real diplomat than I would ever be, and trying to realize that there's sometimes when you have to engage with harder line policies that in order to actually create space in the future for maybe doing something that's constructive. But I honestly don't know. I never did ask him, either in the case of Russia or with Iran. Although I do know that he was quite concerned about the impact on the Iranian people from the sanctions regime. Although I think he thought more of the responsibility for the problems lay with the government, but he did worry about the impact on the ordinary citizen.
Do you have anything?
Sanction, Glenn really had to work hard to get permission from OFAC to allow some of these Iranian scholars to come here to visit, for example, in the air pollution project that I was involved in. That if it was not because of Glenn and Norm Neureiter, we couldn't do it, because the OFAC would not allow this type of thing. And I think Glenn's, as Bill said, with his diplomatic skill, work very hard to not to circumvent sanction, but also to get some relief and waiver for this transfer and for this science diplomacy exchanges.
That was a difficult question, but another question is coming is about how many exchanges were there between National Academy of Sciences, I guess sciences, engineering, medicine, and Iranian institutions. Do we have any kind of information on
Yes.
how many exchanges have there been between the National Academy of Sciences and the Iranian institutions? I guess, Bill?
Well, Professor Meshkati may have the exact number, but what Glenn did so extraordinarily well was he documents every single one of them in these books that we showed. And they were on average every year, 3 to 4 different workshops covering all kinds of topics. So yeah, you can find at least a listing, in some cases a summary of what was actually achieved for every one of these workshops, but it was a large number and they continued up until 2019, I believe. And was still working on trying to see if somehow they could be restarted.
During this period, which is in this book, from 2000 to 2009, during these 9 years, there were 17 jointly organized workshops, usually involving around 25 participants. And a total of around 500 participants attended during this period. And there is a list of the workshops over here in the area of social science and society, preventing and responding to crisis, ecology, and energy. All of that, as Bill mentioned, this is available for free download from National Academy's press website, and they can see that. In the second one, I think I have it here also, similar. The total number, as Glenn's obituary said, there were 3,000 US and American scholars. They were involved in these 18 years of science diplomacy of Glenn.
That's an amazing numbers that I think universities love number of alumni. Maybe one day we could gather up these people together as a Center for Science Diplomacy group to talk about it. But what an amazing number. Final question is really, again, I think it's another political question. I guess talking about US-Iran, we cannot skip political questions. Another political question that has come in, what do you see the role of science diplomacy in conflict preventions in the Middle East? It is good to have scientists exchange viewpoints, but how do you impact policies and conflict resolutions with respect to Middle East? I guess.
Well, as all of us know, these are very complicated societies, and there are people with a number of different views. I was also in the national academies when I was there involved as well in collaboration between Israeli and Palestinian scientists and Jordanian scientists. It was a very active program. Some of it was actually supported by the State Department, but they kept it kind of a low profile because the participants in some of the locations were nervous if if it was too visible and there was too much publicity. But the scientists that participated were all of goodwill. They were doing water issues was one topic. They all believed that it would benefit both countries if they were able to work together to help solve some common problems, and eventually hoping that in the long term it would lead to peace. I know that there are a number of people, both among Palestinian scientists and Israeli scientists, who are, wish things, what they were trying to do, more attention been paid to it, and we could have avoided the terrible tragedies and the death that's occurred in the war. So I know that there are good people in all of these societies. They sometimes they don't have the upper hand, as we know, and their future in large part is going to be determined by themselves. But I think we just have to look at the opportunities that Glenn showed. And Glenn also worked a little bit on the Middle East issues too. there will be opportunities when we can use sciences again as a tool to establish contact. I mean, the reason why both governments for 20 years allowed the scientific academies of the two countries to work together, even though relations weren't very good, it was actually a window, a dialogue window between the two countries, and both governments at that time found it to be very useful. So we can hope there may be at least an improvement to the extent that that kind of window of dialogue provided by the scientific community can be utilized again.
Nash?
I can't agree more with Bill. There are, as Bill mentioned, there have been some area of science diplomacy and collaboration. The Sesame Project, which is in Jordan, it's Bill can speak better about that, and I learned about that from, again, another mentor, Mr. Andy Reynolds, when I was Jefferson Fellow at the State Department. That was a physics project in Jordan that Israeli, Iranian, and some Arab scientists, they were collaborating over there. And it was going on for many years. And again, I have also, we have some colleagues here in USC School of Medicine, Professor Vladimir Zelman, that was a very famous neuroanesthesiologist from Russia. He has been a champion of health diplomacy. And we have been talking with each other, and some other colleague, Dr. Phil Lum, former chair of the anesthesiology department, of using health diplomacy for Middle East. And particularly I've talked about that in my engineering diplomacy class, the concept of pediatric patient safety. Patient safety is an important issue in the United States. Every year, according to the statistics, 200,000 people, they die because of preventable medical errors. And the situation is worse in other countries. Pediatric patient safety is even more complex than patient safety. And we thought that Israelis and Arab neighbors, that is something that they could agree upon, particularly in their hospitals, if they can collaborate on that and learn lessons from each other, and also from the experience that we have at Los Angeles Children's Hospital that I collaborate with them. I had 2 or 3 doctoral students that they did dissertation on pediatric patient safety with Children's Hospital Los Angeles.
If I could just add one thing, I mean, even in these difficult times, the one thing that still makes me optimistic, I had the opportunity to talk to students, mainly university students in a number of countries, including in Iran, including in Russia, including in China, all these places where things they're pretty difficult. Most of them want to make the world a better place. They want to benefit their country. They want to engage around the world, and those that are scientists. And so, although we're turning a lot of this over to them, but I do find some optimism in the voices that I hear from the young people.
By the way, I may not like to put a plug for my dear colleague, Bill Colglazier here. He has written 2 or 3 great articles, which is part of reading in my engineering diplomacy class, about the pandemic and the need for further collaboration among scientists and between US, China, and others to stop pandemic or to control pandemic. I think there's 2 or 3 articles that Bill has written in this, in my humble judgment, are seminal, and they should be must read for all politicians and people that work in health diplomacy and science collaboration.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this ending optimistic note, Bill and Najm. I think one of the things we do at this Institute on U.S.-Iran relations, that we remind people that before 1979, nobody could imagine anything negative happening inside Iran. Today, since then, we cannot imagine anything positive happening inside Iran. And I think one of the most positive things that has happened is that sciences and science diplomacy collaboration with Glenn Schweitzer. And it was a positive, engaged 3,000 plus people, has touched the lives of numerous people. And as Bill mentioned, every time you had somebody there giving a talk, rooms will be packed. Students will just be packed to come in. So with that note, I think that we mentioned all the positive contributions of Glenn here. And we also, Naj put it very nicely in terms of the Iranian perceptions from Howard Baskerville and Samuel Jordan. I truly believe that Glenn Schweitzer was another Howard Baskerville for us, both Iranians. And I want to thank everyone who joined us today for this webinar. We are going to upload the recording plus the video and the questions. And if any of you have any kind of suggestions for readings, I think Nag mentioned some, Bill mentioned some. If you send it to us, we will be making it available to the audience who attended this webinar. And I want to thank both of you for making time for this, both Bill and Naj, from the busy schedule.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bahman. I just want to make, again, the credit goes to American Association for Advancement of Science and the journal Science and Diplomacy that now is, Bill is the editor-in-chief. Science and Diplomacy has published a series of very good articles in this area. One of the articles that I use that as a handout is this article about US and Iran. The subtitle is Gaining and Sharing Scientific Knowledge Through Collaboration by Professor Irene Ann Gillison. It's about US-Iran health diplomacy, and the work that they did was supported by National Institute of Health, Fogarty Centers, and others. That's, again, another area that we owe it to Glenn and the good work that Glenn started, supports by Bill Colglazier, Andy Reynolds at the State Department and others. The area of health diplomacy and the Fogarty Center of National Institute of Health should be acknowledged also.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all of those from the Natural Academies who joined us today. And thank you for taking time. I learned more about Glenn Schweitzer by just attending this webinar today. So we hope to do another event along this series of webinars. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for organizing that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.